It says we are on YouTube live now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to those who have joined us on Zoom and also those who are joining us on YouTube live stream. Welcome to another lecture series here at Karma, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. Today, we are immensely honored to be joined by Dr. Ankur Barua, a senior lecturer at the Department of Hindu Studies, University of Cambridge, the United Kingdom. Sir will be talking to us on a topic of immense importance to the socio-cultural milieu of the Indian subcontinent. And the title for the talk today is Visions of Equality and Structures of Stratifications, Navigating the Present in South Asia. This session is specifically for the Beyond the Myth workshop that we here at Karma have been organizing for about a month now. And we look forward to the session. So without further ado, we would be beginning with the session. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Chandni, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak to this forum. And hello, everyone. Let me begin with the bad news, and then I will move on to what is hopefully good news. The bad news is that I am not the type of scholar you should listen to if you wish to learn about social stratification in South Asian contexts. Who studies social stratification? Well, sociologists, anthropologists, cultural theorists, and political economists. My main focus of research intersects with these lines of inquiry somewhat tangentially. I study certain long-range intellectual and social developments across the religious traditions of South Asia over the last 1,000 years, over the last millennium, especially Hinduism and to some extent Christianity and Islam in British India and post-independence India. So the bad news is that you may find me discussing social stratification and caste in particular without using language with which you are familiar. The good news, or at least I think it is good, is that my interest in the topic of social stratification is animated by a precise question. Why do religions, to be specific, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity, have such a bad track record of delivering socio-cultural and socio-economic equality, especially when they do possess rich resources of vocabularies of spiritual equality? Suppose you are...
Sorry, sir. Sorry to interrupt you. We are not able to view the presentation right now.
So I have not started it.
Oh, great. Sorry.
So suppose you are an impartial spectator from Mars and you have never studied Christian theology or the history of Christianity, and the only thing you know about Christianity is this verse I'm going to recite now from mention now from the New Testament. There is neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. What would you or could you conclude about Christianity from just this verse? Perhaps that all social systems shaped by or founded on Christian visions have reached a state of spiritual equality. And yet, as Christian theologians themselves will remind you, we are all flawed beings who have to continually struggle against our condition of egocentricity. Or take this verse from the ancient Hindu text, the Isha Upanishad. They who see the true self, Atman, in all beings, and all beings in the true self, Atman, feel no hatred or revulsion towards anyone. Again, you are a tourist from Mars, and this is your first contact with a Hindu scripture. What could you conclude? Let me hasten to add that I do not raise these questions rhetorically. I offer them to you as open-ended pointers from your own disciplinary contexts, whether that is sociology, anthropology, philosophy, or political theory. The precise question that I often keep on returning to in my research and my publications is what you see here on the screen. What type of real-world power do ideas, especially religious ideas, have for generating social transformation? And I invite you to keep this question in the backdrop, and perhaps we can return to it in the Q&A. I'm going to speak for around 1 hour or 1 hour and 5 minutes. Now, I myself do not like to give long lectures. However, I have realized that in contexts such as this forum, where I do not quite know who my intended audience is, it is better to speak a bit more than a bit less. Now, as we begin to address the magnificent question, what is the relation between Hinduism and caste? let us reflect on the general structure of such questions. When we ask what is the Hindu or what is the Christian or what is the Muslim view of X or Y or Z, we have to keep in mind that categories such as Hindu or Christian or Muslim are all internally multi-stranded. That is to say, they encompass a diverse range, a spectrum of beliefs and practices. So before we proceed, here are a few preliminary notes about the term Hindu and the term Hinduism. The term Hindu can be traced back to a particular word, Sindhu, which is a word in Vedic Sanskrit, roughly from around 1500 BCE. And the word Sindhu possibly applies to the river that we today call the Indus. This word Sindhu became in the vocabulary of Persians from around 500 BCE the word Hindu. That is, the sa sound was dropped, and instead we have the h sound. Now the Greeks, sometime around 300 BCE, dropped the sa sound as well and produced words like Indos and Indikoi. And these are the sounds that you will hear in present-day words for India in languages such as Spanish, French, and Italian. From around 800 CE onwards, the Arabs started talking about this land as Al-Hind. So here is the socio-linguistic complexity in the form of multiple words that we have inherited from around 3 millennia of socio-political, socio-cultural history. We have words such as Hindi, Hindu, Hinduism, and Hindustan. Terms such as India, Hindu, and Hinduism started their socio-linguistic existence in the form of what are called exonyms. That is, names given to a group of people or a cultural formation or a social grouping by others. So terms such as Hindu were used primarily in the geographical, territorial, ethno-linguistic, or cultural sense. Sometime around 200 BCE or 900 CE, the term Hindu had not picked up some of its present-day distinctively religious connotations and significations. You may now ask me a very difficult question. So, precisely when did the sense become religious as well? This is a deeply contested topic in the scholarship, partly because of the great variation in definitions of the term religion. However, without going too deep into these debates on this occasion, let's simply say arguably sometime after 1400 CE and more definitively after 1850 and move on. To highlight this point, here is a conceptual distinction we may make between two senses of the term Hindu and the term Hinduism. In one sense, Hinduism is a socio-cultural phenomenon. We will sometimes encounter Hindus who speak in this way. Well, regarding specifically religious views about the world, regarding questions about our true source and our ultimate destiny, regarding styles of spirituality and so on, I am a non-believer or an agnostic, but I do have certain cultural sensibilities, some social sensibilities that I have inherited from sources that are regarded in my wider group as Hindu. And that would be an example of someone who understands themselves as socio-culturally Hindu, but not religiously Hindu. For instance, such a Hindu may wish to be cremated and not buried, not because cremation is associated with specific religious or cosmological beliefs that this particular person affirms, but because cremation is the common socio-cultural practice. And there are individuals, of course, who regard themselves not only culturally as Hindu, but also religiously as Hindu. Now, this is the spectrum of the development of Hindu texts and traditions in South Asia from a chronological perspective. The narrative, the stories start sometime around 1500 BCE with the Vedas, and we move down the line to the Upanishads, which begin to emerge sometime around 800, 900 BCE. We continue to move along this temporal continuum, and sometime around the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century CE of the Common Era, we find the final forms, more or less, of texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana. Then from around 800 CE, Common Era, onwards, there are numerous attempts to systematize or crystallize all these different scriptural strands, such as the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, and so on. and produce a consolidated system in the style of what we would today call philosophy or theology. These multiple attempts to harmonize or distill the essence of scriptural texts are today placed in the category called Vedanta. By 1500, several systems of Vedanta have emerged. The narratives of Hindu worldviews, Hinduism, does not, of course, stop at 1500. There are multiple reconfigurations, reworkings, or recalibrations of the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, and other texts in our own times, including today in 2024. And the historical continuum you see on this slide, therefore, embodies the evolving stream of the living tradition of multiple styles of Hinduism. And one way to capture this dynamic combination of some long-range continuities across 3 millennia and specific local regional discontinuities is to use the double negation you see here, neither one nor many. So to begin with, we should speak of Hinduisms in the plural. Here, neither one is a reminder that as we study the multiple Hindu traditions in the plural, as they have been developing in the Indian subcontinent over the last 3,000 years or so, we need several poly prefixes to characterize them. So Hinduisms are polycentric traditions. If we go looking for one particular center this weekend and declare, yes, once and for all, I have isolated the very living heart of Hinduism, and here is that center, that invariant core, you may soon encounter on Monday or Tuesday another 3 or 4 or 5 or 20 centers. Likewise, Hinduisms are polymorphic formations. That is, they comprise multiple forms developing across 2,000, 3,000 years. Again, Hinduisms are polylinguistic textures. The sacred language is, of course, Sanskrit, but there are multiple vernacular iterations or expressions of the sacred Sanskrit archetypes. And all of this is to comment on the reminder, neither one. However, why do I add not many? To give you a simple answer, this is because although Hinduism is not simply one thing, it is also the case that Hinduism is not just about anything and everything. There are some long-range overlapping patterns, some similarities across these polycentric, polymorphic, and polylinguistic dissimilarities. And in this lecture today, over the next maybe 50 minutes, we are going to explore one such recurring pattern, namely an exegetical or hermeneutic tension between two bodies of scriptural texts. And what I mean by hermeneutic or exegetical is a tension about how to read scriptural texts and what a particular scriptural text means. So the dialectic, the opposition, the struggle or the tussle that we are going to explore today is between texts such as the Manusmriti on the one hand and texts such as Vedantic commentaries and the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads on the other hand. While the Manusmriti, which claims to be re-articulating the authoritative voice of the Vedas, often affirms socio-ritual codes of hierarchy, some Hindu thinkers, by pulling together strands from the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, have highlighted or affirmed visions of spiritual equality. So on the one hand, we have an idealized order of social hierarchy, and on the other hand, we have some visions of spiritual sameness. So let's propose the question directly. Which voice is more dominant or which voice is dominant across Hindu cultures? Number one, the voice of hierarchy, or number two, the voice of equality. Alternatively, we may ask, to go back to my original question, do visions of Hindu spiritual equality have sufficient real-world momentum to undermine social institutions which have become established through visions of hierarchy? So we have Shruti, namely texts such as the Vedas and the Upanishads, which are regarded as infallible. And the Sanskrit word Shruti means that which is heard. So the claim is that the Vedas and the Upanishads do not have human authors or human composers. Some sages or seers received or heard the syllables, words, or statements in the scriptures, which are said to give us divine truths, sacred truths, about the nature of the divine reality, Brahman, and the human self, Atman. The text categorized as Smriti, which is a word which means that which is remembered, are said to have specific human authors. So the two great epic narratives of Hinduism, namely the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, have distinct human authors, and the Manusmriti is said to be composed by a lawgiver, that is somebody who has laid down the dharma, called Manu. So all these texts are placed in the category of Smriti. Now, the crucial hermeneutic or exegetical rule is that if there is a dispute or if there is a conflict or if there is an inconsistency between Shruti and Smriti, it is Shruti that will override Smriti. Now, one question we are exploring in our lecture today is this. If there are certain scriptural texts which affirm notions of sociological hierarchy, and if there are also certain scriptural texts which affirm a deep spiritual continuity, how do we negotiate this opposition, this seeming inconsistency? Now, the time frame when the Manusmriti is being composed is the time frame when certain orthodox styles of Hindu ways of thinking, Hindu ways of imagining the universe, Hindu ways of being and belonging are gradually emerging. So we have the epic narrative, the Ramayana, which runs into around 25,000 verses, and the other epic narrative, the Mahabharata, which runs into around 90,000 verses in the critical edition. And we have the Manusmriti, which belongs to a genre of texts called the Dharma Shastras, which are treatises or commentaries which outline, which delineate the Dharma. And the notion of Dharma emerges in the Rig Veda sometime around 1500 BCE, and the Dharma Shastras are being codified and compiled by Brahmin male authors from around 200-100 CE, Common Era, and these texts contain their visions of an ideal or an idealized social universe. Now, here is one way to present the hermeneutic or the exegetical tension I mentioned a while ago. On the one hand, we have a category called Brahminical Sanskritic Hinduism. It's a big word, BSH, and its commentarial texts are written in Sanskrit by Brahmin men who sometimes project a vision of the universe which is hierarchical, androcentric, and patriarchal. On the other hand, there are multiple movements which have tried to undermine, interrogate, rework, or recalibrate BSH. And these processes have sometimes been successful, sometimes they have been only partly successful, and sometimes they have not been successful at all. So we should not view the right-hand side of this slide and the left-hand side of this slide as constituting two neatly opposed blocks, but rather we should view them as two sets of ideas and institutions which are often densely entangled in social history. That is, various movements which have tried to oppose or interrogate BSH often draw on the very language of BSH, that is the language of Vedic commentarial texts. And one expression of this dialectic you see on this slide is the tension between two sets of idioms or two sets of languages. One set of idioms is centered around the language of adhikara, and the other is centered around the language of Atman. So on the one hand, there is the claim that not all human beings have the ritual eligibility or capacity or qualification to read the Vedas and receive Vedic instruction and thereby move towards liberation, moksha, mukti. On the other hand, there is also the proclamation of a deep spiritual egalitarianism which is rooted in or grounded in the spiritual self, Atman, beyond gender, beyond caste, beyond ethnicity, and beyond every possible sociological marker you can think of. And thus, there is, as I have put it here on the slide, a volatile nexus running through multiple forms of Hindu sociocultural, socio-ritual living, where a vision of equality on the one hand can collide with a vision of hierarchy on the other hand. And on this slide, you see a schematic outline of how over the last 2000 years of Hindu sociocultural history, various attempts have been made to do something about this nexus, which is volatile. Why? Because it seems to be saying that all human beings are equal, but some human beings are more equal than the others, because only some human beings have the requisite ritual or social qualification. So the affirmation of spiritual equality is followed by a series of sociological disclaimers. And what are we to make of this somewhat unstable conjunction? Do we bypass it? Do we dissolve it? Do we resolve it? Do we redescribe it? Do we pretend it does not exist? Do we somehow just live with it? From a socio-historical perspective, on this slide, you see three ways of engaging with it. So the first attempt goes like this. Since we are all spiritually equal, this transcendental spiritual equality must be institutionalized in the here and now. So the claim is that our everyday social transactions and our everyday socio-economic structures must directly express and reflect and embody our vision of spiritual equality. The second attempt suggests that a system of social hierarchy can somehow coexist with a vision of spiritual equality. Here, the claim is that what really matters is not the mutable physical body, which is marked with social hierarchy, but the Atman, which is beyond all markers of social inequality. So the claim is that we should not be too concerned about socio-economic or socio-cultural inequality. What is vitally important is the spiritual self or the imperishable self, the jiva or the Atman. And our spiritual identity is as devotees, bhaktas of the one true God, in this case, Krishna or Vishnu or Shiva or sometimes the Devi, the goddess. So the second response, which you see on this slide, does not deny that there are real-world socio-economic asymmetries out there, but claims that our focus should not be on engaging with such asymmetries directly, but on cultivating the proper relationship between the human self and the divine self. The third attempt is somewhat similar to the second one, and it makes the following claim. If we dutifully discharge our dharmic obligations, our dharmic responsibilities, by remaining in our own station or place, we will gradually move across multiple reincarnations to the state of spiritual equality. So what is common to the second and the third attempt is this. They do not offer a direct interrogation or critique of socio-economic or socio-cultural hierarchy, but claim that what really matters is not social inequality, but the liberation of the embodied self from worldly finitude. Now, the template for many of these debates across 2,000 years of Hindu socio-cultural history is one of the most frequently cited verses from the Rig Veda. The Rig Vedic narrative of origin states that in the beginning, there was a primordial sacrifice where the cosmic person, Purusha, was ritually dismembered. And this sacrificial ritual is said to be the generative matrix of all types of dharmic order we see in the universe. So all types of cosmological regularity, social structure, and political stability have emanated from this ritual sacrifice in the beginning. And crucially, for our purposes, four groups have also emerged from the sacrifice. The Brahmins, who are the priests, the Rajanya, or later known as the Kshatriya, who are the warriors, the Vaishyas, who are the farmers, and the Shudras, who are the servants. You see that I characterized this world picture on this slide with the phrase hierarchy and interconnection. And that and is to highlight the volatile nexus I indicated earlier. So on the one hand, this world picture is a vision of interconnection. All these four groups have emanated from one common source, namely the ritual cosmic sacrifice, and they're all rooted in one common reality. On the other hand, this very world picture becomes in later texts such as the Manusmriti a blueprint, a template for social hierarchy. Crucially, however, the Sanskrit text itself of these Rig Vedic verses does not outline or lay down any hierarchical ordering. So it does not say, the text itself, that the priests are superior ritually or socially to other groups. Now, from a historical point of view, this verse is sometimes dated at around 900, 800 BCE, before the Common Era. We will return to this very verse when we discuss the Manusmriti, which is composed sometime around 100, 200 CE, Common Era. Now, before we go to the Manusmriti, here is a sketch of Vedantic visions. The Upanishads repeatedly affirm that the spiritual ground of all finite entities is Atman or Brahman, and it generates the $1 billion or the billion rupee question for Hindu philosophy, Hindu theology. What is the relation between Atman and Brahman? According to one style known as Advaita Vedanta, the true self, Atman, is not the I, which is marked with various types of sociological inscriptions. That is, this is not the I who's speaking to you right now, but the trans-individual self, which is beyond all names, all forms, all qualities, all descriptions, all attributes, all features. And this deep I has no differentiators such as language, class, caste, gender, race, YouTube channel, driving license, passport, visa, and so on. So the true referent of the pronoun I is not a finite entity, but this universal self in all beings, which is non-dual or Advaita, with Brahman, which is the qualityless foundation of all reality. And here is a somewhat different style, the religious worldview shaped by devotional love, bhakti. In them, the claim is that what we truly are is not this biophysical complex, but the true self, the jiva or the Atman, and this true self, the individual self, is existentially dependent on a supremely personal Lord who can be Krishna or Vishnu or Shiva or the goddess in different Hindu contexts. Now, for our purposes in this lecture, what we are interested in is not so much the differences between these two styles, style 1 and style 2, but what they share in common. Namely, the claim that the true center of gravity in the human person is not the mutable physical body, but the Atman that is beyond all empirical hierarchies, all social markers, all cultural differentiators. So once again, we see how the voice of spiritual equality is entering into complex intersections with notions, subjectivities, and institutions of caste. Now, one aspect of the great challenge of understanding caste in South Asia is that we would have to employ a series of disciplinary lenses from social anthropology, cultural studies, political theory, philosophy, and theology. Number one, we would have to do field work in different regions of India, rural, semi-urban, urban, and metropolitan, to understand how caste-shaped identities intersect with local, regional power structures. As a cultural anthropologist or a social anthropologist, we might spend 6 months, 8 months, 6 years in a village in North India or West India or South India, living with a family and observing how people interact with one another across different social groupings. Often, there is a strong correlation between socio-economic impoverishment on the one hand and what is called an ascriptive identity towards the bottom of the caste spectrum on the other hand. Then, we would have to explore how individuals with such different ascriptions of caste may or may not have access to resources such as primary education, healthcare, and so on, and how individuals may negotiate for power in socio-political spaces structured with the vocabulary of caste. Number three, as political theorists, we would be studying phenomena such as how Hindus who belong to specific caste groupings or locations may vote for specific political parties. So we would study how notions of caste are culturally reproduced across generations, across centuries, and how forms of material inequality are either reinforced or challenged through multiple sociological pathways. In this lecture, you will be happy to note that I am not undertaking such a holistic cross-disciplinary exercise, which would require several volumes and even an encyclopedia and several lectures. We are looking primarily at certain notions of caste in Hindu scriptural texts. Now, given the multiple styles of worldviews encompassed by the term Hinduism, as I have indicated, and given that caste itself can be studied from different scholarly perspectives, as I have indicated just now, you can see how formidable, how daunting the task is of spelling out the precise conjunction in the phrase Hinduism and caste. Depending on what you mean by Hinduism and depending on whether you take caste to be primarily a socio-economic, socio-political, socio-cultural, cosmological, or theological category, the and, the conjunction, will receive different formulations and responses. Having said all of that, let us stand back from all this complexity for a minute. And suppose you ask me, well, can't you give me a one-line definition of caste? Well, if you push me to the wall like that, I will say, caste is a form of social stratification that has been alternately reinforced or critiqued by cosmological visions rooted in Vedic commentaries. Now, another aspect of the difficulty, of the challenge of engaging with the complex spectrum of phenomena that the term caste encompasses is that the English word caste translates two distinct Sanskrit words, varna and jati. And these words are found in many modern Indian languages as well. The term that we find in the Vedas and various other texts such as the Manusmriti is varna. If you look up the word varna in a Sanskrit dictionary, you will get around 8 to 10 to 12 different meanings, such as class, color, group, syllable, and unit. Now, in the Rig Veda, in the Rig Vedic text that I showed you, we read that there are 4 varnas. So the priests, the kings, the farmers, and the servants. Yeah, Chandni, do you want to say something?
No, sir.
Everything is going fine?
Yeah, yes, sir. It's totally.
Now, when the Portuguese, they arrived at Goa sometime around 1500, they applied the Portuguese term casta, which means breed or lineage, to the social formations that they encountered in Western India. Now, the fourfold Varna scheme represents an idealized textual template. If, as a social anthropologist or a cultural anthropologist, you go looking for 4 Varnas in many parts of India, you will not be able to isolate or demarcate such distinct groups. Instead, if you do ethnography or field work in a village or a small town, you will find that the ritual economy or the political economy of that place is structured by hundreds and hundreds of jatis. So in contemporary writing in English on quote-unquote caste, the Sanskrit term we are grappling with is not so much a varna, to repeat the idealized social template of 4 groups rooted in a Vedic ritual sacrifice, but the multiple jatis. Now, here are a few characteristics of the notion or the category of jati. First, jatis are traditionally endogamous, that is, people would find a marriage partner within a specific jati. Second, many jatis have traditional occupations which are passed down generations, such as jatis of barbers, carpenters, leather workers, tanners, and so on. Third, many jatis are marked out on a ritual spectrum where certain kinds of occupations are associated with ritual purity and certain kinds of occupations are associated with ritual impurity or defilement. So it is claimed that certain kinds of occupation make individuals and groups who perform them ritually defiled. Generally speaking, the claim seems to be that those occupations which bring us into contact with decaying matter, dirt, or disease make us ritually defiled. The precise details will vary from region to region across South Asia and India, and each region will have its own local arrangements of the ritual economy. From a cosmological, that is a Vedic perspective, here is a way to understand the correlation between occupation and purity. The Vedic cosmos is poised on a knife-edge balance between order or dharma and disorder or adharma. So occupations which involve matter out of its proper place or position take an individual into the domain of adharma, and that domain of adharma is associated with impurity. Now, with these notes, let us return to the verses I showed you a while ago from the 10th chapter of the Rig Veda, roughly 800-900 BCE. And to repeat, the notion of ritual purity or ritual defilement does not appear in the text itself. Now, in the Manusmriti, roughly 100 or 200 CE, Common Era, we find a vision of a differentiated social body where 4 groups are demarcated on a ritual continuum of purity and impurity. So we read in the Manusmriti, in order to preserve the world, so we find the notion of dharma here, the world producer in the beginning assigned separate functions to those who sprang from the mouth, 1, the arms, 2, the thighs, 3, and the feet, number 4. So the composer of the Manusmriti is invoking a Vedic archetype, a Vedic paradigm of the production of the world through the sacrificial dismemberment of the cosmic Purusha, and adding the crucial point that the ritual priest, namely the Brahmin, is the purest. And as we go down the ritual ladder through the 3 groups or the varnas of the rulers, the cultivators or farmers, and the servants, there is a gradual decrease or decline of ritual purity. So we hear the claim that those who belong to the lower ends of this ritual spectrum, provided they fulfill and discharge properly their dharmic responsibilities, can gradually move up the ladder, the karmic ladder. So hopefully, at some point in the future, they would reach the summit and become Brahmins themselves. So we find a clear delineation of the social body, which is differentially ordered with distinct dharmic qualifications, responsibilities, and duties. Shudras would obediently serve the highest class, and by discharging their dharmic obligations, they would obtain a higher birth subsequently. So to use our present day categories, it is almost as if the Manusmriti is saying there is social mobility, but not necessarily within one lifetime. Instead, we have a vision of, so to speak, transworldly social mobility. So gradually, an individual would ascend the socio-ritual ladder and move across multiple reincarnations or rebirths to a higher social status. And that is why, a while ago, I characterized this set of ideas and institutions as a gradualist style of sociological hierarchy in the category BSH. So this is a worldview of social gradualism. There is no call to restructure society right now. Instead, there is a cosmological optimism that and it's a very big if one has sufficient patience, one will gradually move up the socio-ritual ladder. Now, alongside the challenge, the great difficulty of understanding the multiply dimensioned phenomena of caste is the challenge of uncovering the socio-historical origins of untouchability. The claim here is that certain social groups are in a permanent state of ritual defilement, and therefore individuals within the fourfold Varna scheme or system would avoid all social cultural exchanges with them. Various terms have been used in Sanskrit texts for such groups, for instance, Chandala or Pulkasa. Different theories, or perhaps we should say hypotheses, have been proposed regarding the origins of untouchability. For instance, perhaps these groups have emerged through cross marriages, which are prohibited by dharmic authoritative texts such as the Manusmriti between the 4 Varnas. Now, on this occasion, without proposing yet another theory or hypothesis, let's simply look at the text of the Manusmriti itself, which indicates very clearly the association between ritual impurity and occupation. The Chandalas will live outside the village. A man who follows the Dharma, so you see the notion of Dharma, will never seek any dealings with them. All their transactions will be among themselves and they will marry their own kind. So the notion of endogamy, they will carry away the corpses of those without relatives. So here we see a form of physical segregation, partly shaped by an association between death and disease, which symbolize non-dharma or anti-dharma, and an occupational style in which individuals become directly connected with decaying or dead matter. Now, before we look at some of the other types of scriptural texts, such as the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, which try to interrogate such forms of social hierarchy, let's step back and ask, in general, what is the relation between scriptural text and socio-historical context? Now, both these categories, namely text or religious scripture and context or social hierarchy, are multi-stranded units, and they encompass diverse ideas, institutions, processes. The question we are addressing now on this slide is simply this. What is the relation between, on the one hand, religious cosmologies, and on the other hand, concrete patterns of social stratification in the everyday world? Or more concisely, we may ask, which way does the causal arrow operate, from text to context or from context to text? Let's consider the first possibility. So, someone has composed a religious scripture or written a commentary and declared, let there be so many castes, let there be 4 varnas, and let there be 5,000 jatis, and almost overnight, or in the next 3 weeks, or the next 3 months, hierarchies begin to appear on the social landscape. Consider this second possibility. Certain types of social hierarchies are already out there, and these hierarchies have been generated by complex socio-economic transitions or socio-political transformations. What someone does when they write a religious commentary is to encode and legitimize these already existing social hierarchies. So to summarize these two possibilities, the question we are asking is this: is it the case that religious scripture produces social hierarchy, or is it the case that already existing social hierarchy is simply reflected in religious scripture? Now, as we all know, social reality is often very messy in the sense that it cannot be precisely captured in terms of causal pathways. So let's consider a third way between these two possibilities I have highlighted, namely, certain emerging or incipient forms of sociocultural hierarchy relating to caste would have been codified by texts such as the Manusmriti, and this codification invested these forms of hierarchy with a sacred aura, with a sacred meaning. And why is that so? Because texts such as the Manusmriti are written in Sanskrit, the sacred language of the Vedas, and the claimed authenticity or primordiality of Vedic truth would have legitimized and re-entrenched social hierarchies even as they're emerging. So here is a slightly different way of raising these questions. Should we read a text such as the Manusmriti, a Dharmashastra text such as the Manusmriti from the 2nd or the 1st century of CE, primarily as a prescriptive text or primarily as a descriptive text? So if we read it primarily as a descriptive text, we would be saying that the Manusmriti is simply describing what is already happening out there. So by the time of the composition of the Manusmriti, that is the 2nd century CE, some of the ideas and institutions of caste are becoming established on the subcontinent, and they are simply being described or redescribed by the Manusmriti. So the Manusmriti is reflecting a social reality where there really are 4 varnas and really so many jatis and different forms of socio-political exchanges and ritual transactions. On the other hand, we may read the Manusmriti primarily as a prescriptive text, so we will be taking its cosmological visions as similar to those of, say, Plato's Dialogue Republic, where Plato is not describing a social system right in front of him, but sketching the contours of a social system he would very much like to live in. So do we go with the primarily descriptive reading or with the primarily prescriptive reading of the Manusmriti? And reflecting the third way I highlighted a while ago, it is possible that the Manusmriti contains descriptive dimensions as well as prescriptive dimensions. That is, some layers of the Manusmriti are more or less good reflections of actually existing practices and institutions in 200 CE, and there are also some prescriptive layers which embody the socio-ritual anxieties of the composer or composers of the Manusmriti. Now, at the time of the composition of the Manusmriti, the Maurya Empire is at the height of its power, and Ashoka, one of his most famous rulers, becomes a Buddhist, that is, an individual who is beyond the circumference of Vedic Dharma. So reading the Manusmriti as a prescriptive text, its composer is indicating that social anarchy and moral disorder, that is adharma, will prevail if the ritual authority of Brahmins is not promoted in an ideal socio-political, that is, dharmic structure. So instead, the Manusmriti is presenting its own view of what the ideal dharmic socio-political structure is, namely a structure that embodies and implements Vedic norms. Now, all this discussion concerns a text from roughly the 2nd century CE. Let us ask this question, in which I am myself very interested. How are notions and practices of caste culturally reproduced across generations, across centuries? And one way to answer this question is to think in terms of a conjunction, of an association between, on the one hand, the symbolic power of some cosmological narratives, and, on the other hand, the coercive power of local rulers or landlords who try to implement those cosmological narratives on the ground. So, on the one hand, there is the symbolic power of the Manusmriti, whose author claims to speak with Vedic authority. So the voice of the Manusmriti is Vedic truth. And to repeat, in many traditional Hindu contexts, Vedic truth is the gold epistemic standard. However, this claim that this is the voice of the Vedas would itself not amount to much unless it is enforced at the grassroots by kings or chieftains. So through a symbiotic interaction between, on the one hand, the coercive power of rulers who would have tried to implement the social vision of a text such as the Manusmriti, and on the other hand, the symbolic power of texts written in Sanskrit, which is the sacred language, certain forms of ideas and institutions of caste would have become stabilized in pre-modern South Asia. Now, even as all these visions of social hierarchy are being generated, codified, compiled, and legitimized by appeal to Vedic authority, we also find scriptural verses which interrogate or negate such hierarchical visions. So here is a text from the Katha Upanishad, roughly dated 600 BCE. Whoever sees difference here goes from death to death. Another Upanishad, the Upanishad I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk, declares, they who see all beings in their true Atman, their own self, and see their own Atman in all beings, would not feel any hatred or revulsion towards anything. And here's a text from here's a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. Wise people would see with the vision of equality all these beings, a Brahmin, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and a ritual outcast. So in other words, we encounter the claim that difference, whether it is social difference or cultural difference or ritual difference, is somehow unreal. The verse from the Isha Upanishad on this slide is reworked in a text called the Bhagavata Purana, roughly dated at, let's say, 900 CE. They who see their own self existing in all beings as the Lord, and see all beings as established in the self which is the Lord, are the best devotees of the Lord. And in this very same text, the Bhagavata Purana, we read about a sage called Rantideva. So as Rantideva is about to eat, a series of guests arrive. First, a Brahmin, then a Shudra, then another individual with a pack of dogs, to whom he distributes whatever food is left. Next, an outcast, a Pulkasa, arrives and begs him to give, that is, begs Rantideva to give him some water to drink. And the text tells us Rantideva is greatly moved with compassion, kripa, and states that he seeks, that is, Rantideva, seeks from the Lord neither yogic powers nor liberation from samsara, transmigratory existence. Rantideva would dwell with all beings and undergo suffering for all beings so that all these beings can be freed from their suffering. And that brings us back to the exegetical, hermeneutic, conceptual tussle that goes on across multiple Hindu cultural universes. So to repeat, on the one hand, there are attempts to invoke Vedic cosmologies to affirm social hierarchy, but on the other hand, there are numerous appeals to the spiritual self as the primary identity of all human beings. Now, as we come to a close for this lecture, let's look at some more examples of styles of resolving, dissolving the volatile nexus. And here is Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, the second president of the Indian Republic after independence. And he is writing that restrictions regarding eligibility, that is adhikara, that we find in some texts cannot be defended. And his reasoning is that if we accept the potential divinity of all human beings, whether these be, whatever be their caste or class, race or religion, sex or occupation, the methods for gaining liberation, moksha, should be open to all. And what he means by potential divinity, he's of course writing in English, is the underlying Atman, the spiritual self. So here is another attempt to invoke the spiritual center of gravity, namely the Atman, to articulate a vision of egalitarianism. Now, even before we get to Radhakrishnan, who is a figure from our times, in the pre-modern centuries too, we occasionally find certain attempts to interrogate the hierarchical visions of texts such as the Manusmriti. So once again, here is the Bhagavata Purana. We read, I regard a dog eater whose mind, speech, efforts, wealth, and life are dedicated to Vishnu to be superior to a Brahmin who is endowed with the 12 virtues, but who has turned his face away from the lotus feet of Vishnu. And this theme is often found in texts from the milieus of devotionalism, bhakti. The key claim is that the intensity of bhakti of God is more valuable than one's ritual status. So even though someone may be a Brahmin and therefore has the ritual eligibility or the adhikara to study the Vedas, if they turn away from Vishnu, they are not as equipped on the spiritual pathway as a person who happens to be ritually impure but is devoted to Vishnu. And so we can think of this text as proposing a solution of the second type I mentioned earlier. So the claim is not that there are no social hierarchies in the world out there, but that what really matters is the strength of one's devotional love, because one's bhakti is the true marker of one's spiritual status. An even more robust rejection of all markers of caste is associated with a 15th century figure called Kabir, who is said to have been born of Muslim parents and raised by Hindu foster parents. And Kabir would often write iconoclastic verses against priestly authorities and different aspects of socio-religious hierarchy. So he says, Pandit, look into your heart for knowledge. Tell me from where untouchability emerges, since you believe in it. We eat by touching, we wash by touching. From a touch, the whole world is born. And Kabir asks, who is untouched? In our own times, the Bauls, who are wandering singers in parts of West Bengal, reject all distinctions of self and other, pure and impure, and speak of the deep I that transcends all sociological inscriptions. And some followers of Baul teachers have developed vernacularized versions of Advaita Vedanta, the system I mentioned a while ago, which are oriented towards the quest for socio-economic equality. And here is a scholar who says, I have often heard even uninitiated rural Bengalis, Muslims as well as Hindus, explain non-dualism or Advaita as non-differentiation and non-discrimination in a highly radical sense. For example, in terms of possessiveness. The more conventionally religious would rarely draw such radical corollaries, of course, and I like that emphasis, of course. In other words, the message of these vows is an instance of the claim, become what you are. So if you are all spiritually equal, the spiritual equality must become concretely expressed in the heat and dust of everyday existence. Now, a while ago, we saw Radhakrishnan invoking the notion of potential divinity to undercut claims to ritual eligibility or adhikara on the part, only on the part of certain groups, certain varnas. And sometime around 800 CE, Shankara, who is the great systematizer of Advaita Vedanta, was clear that from a sociological perspective, Shudras do not have the ritual eligibility or the adhikara to receive Vedic wisdom. I add from a sociological perspective because even Shankara would not deny that from an ultimate or transcendental perspective, there are no differences across different types of beings. Indeed, his own disciple Shureshwara acknowledges that the spiritual light that shines in the deity Brahma is the same spiritual light that shines in the ritual outcast Chandala. And regarding this hermeneutic complexity, Anantanand Rambachan has observed criticism of caste inequality as far as the knowledge of Brahman, the ultimate reality, is concerned, can also find justification in the Advaita teaching about the identity and sameness of self in all beings. It remains a matter of concern that the greatest historical exponent of this teaching, namely Shankara, remained untroubled by social inequality, a contradiction that he notes that is still not uncommon. So Rambachan's point is that traditions, Vedantic Hindu traditions such as Advaita, possess the resources, symbolic or conceptual, to critique caste-based distinctions, but these resources are underemployed or not used at all. And as a result, structural inequalities associated with the everyday language of caste are allowed to coexist with a symbolic invocation of spiritual equality. And similar complexities emerge in the different expressions of devotional love or bhakti over the last 500 years. Now, given that the vision of the Lord, Vishnu or Krishna or Shiva or the goddess encompasses all human beings, cosmological visions of bhakti would seem to contain an egalitarian edge that can cut through caste-based claims of eligibility, adhikara, based on occupational style, endogamous grouping, and ritual purity. And indeed, as we know, many figures associated with the bhakti-shaped worlds of Hindu social existence are women and individuals from the lower end of the caste spectrum. Once again, however, one should not think in terms of one singular response on the part of all bhakti-animated visions regarding how self-surrender to the Lord may interrogate, challenge, or undermine caste-based hierarchies. The hagiographies, or spiritual biographies, of bhakti saints from the lower castes are sometimes ambivalent in their rejection of Brahminical privileges. So even as they claim that bhakti transcends boundaries of caste, they may affirm some notions of caste purity and social hierarchy. And some of these devotional movements associated with figures such as Chaitanya, Tulsidas, and others can be regarded as social revolutions to the extent that the egalitarian language of bhakti threatens the cultural prestige and ritual privilege of Brahmin priests. However, this language of bhakti did not, generally speaking, animate or call for a wholesale dissolution of social hierarchy. In other words, such devotional movements were not concerned directly with socio-economic transformation or structural alteration of the ritual economy. For instance, some of the early followers of Chaitanya in the 16th century usually accepted social restrictions relating to Varna Ashrama Dharma, such as devotees of different jatis not intermarrying or not interdining for the sake of maintaining social order, dharma, and avoiding misunderstanding with wider traditional contexts. Therefore, according to the scholar Joseph O'Connell, they maintained an interesting combination of quote-unquote egalitarian affectivity with fellow devotees in settings such as religious festivals and inegalitarian functionality in everyday mundane situations. So the moral of the story for this slide is this, that we should be careful not to read some of our present-day ideas of individual equality and social reform back into 15th, 16th, 17th century texts and traditions. The tension we have been exploring in this lecture so far is embodied in a nutshell in this conversation between Swami Vivekananda, who needs no introduction, and a certain priest. If I, that is Swami Vivekananda, if I ask one of our priests in India, do you believe in Vedanta? He says, that is my religion. I certainly do. That is my life. Very well. Do you admit the equality of all life, the sameness of everything? Certainly I do. The next moment, when the low-caste man approaches this priest, he jumps to one side of the street to avoid that man. Why do you jump? Because his very touch would have polluted me. But you were just saying that we are all the same, and you admit there is no difference in souls. He says, oh, that is in theory only, for householders. When I go into a forest, then I will look upon everyone as the same. And here is the final point, and I will end. Should we speak of caste in terms of quote-unquote system or in terms of quote-unquote process? So on the one hand, there are some deep systemic and structural dimensions of caste, such that caste is enmeshed in long-range modes of socioeconomic deprivation, social exclusion, physical segregation, and so on. On the other hand, various individuals and groups over the last 2 millennia or so have developed some forms of negotiation with caste-based ideas and institutions, so that there has been mobility, even if limited, across borderlines of caste. I wish there was a word in the English language for something that is simultaneously structural and processive. And let us coin such a word, symprocess. And we may say that in some contexts in South Asia, caste-based universes are characterized by quote-unquote symprocess. Recently, I wrote an article on multiple reconfigurations of caste in Indian locations with a friend, and this is one central question we seek to address in that article. How may we reconcile texts such as the Upanishads that proclaim an equality based on the spiritual self with texts such as the Manusmriti that prescribe societally differentiated eligibilities and duties based on hierarchies of gender and caste? And this is the note on which we end the essay and the note on which I will end my lecture. Thus, caste is a hydra-headed phenomenon which is as much out there as in here. With wide-ranging material transformations in social systems, inequalities often become relocated or redistributed. And this reorganization of socioeconomic power may call for newer definitions of caste in the changed context. So on that note, I shall end, Chandni.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very thought-stimulating